All of you by now know the routine. We switched it up a bit. We actually are in a new room. Welcome to the Pacific Room of the National Arts Centre, looking out over the mighty Pacific. And folks at home won't know any better. And that's the Kawartha Voyager. I think there's rides on the Kawartha Voyager afterwards. Lollipops for the kids, fun for the whole family. You know the routine. I invite a prominent Canadian newsmaker to come up and join us. In the first half, I lull them into a false sense of security, and in the second half, I pounce. We're going to speed up the tempo a little bit tonight because there's some business to take care of. Next week, the Kinder Morgan Company of Houston, Texas, is going to tell the world whether they feel like building a pipeline anymore. That's of pressing interest to everybody in the country, and especially to the folks in Alberta. And my guest tonight, Jason Kenney, is hoping at some near point to become the Premier of Alberta. And he's been making a lot of noise about this file. So we're going to do just a little bit of lulling, and then the pouncing will happen a little earlier. I want you to put your hands together and welcome our guest this evening, Jason Kenney.
Sir.
Welcome to the Pacific.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for accepting our invitation. It's not quite as easy for you as it is for our Ottawa guests. You had to actually come in from out of town.
I had to take the red eye, so you've got an advantage over me for sure.
Now, last time I saw you here, you were, what's the line of somebody who has the worst possible election outcome? His party loses government, but he wins his seat. You were a member of the Conservative Opposition Caucus. What did you want to do in those days and weeks after the election? What were you thinking your next 5 years was going to look like?
Well, first, I just wanted to catch up on my sleep. During the last election, which seemed to go on forever, there was about 3 months for me, from July till October of 15. I'm told I did something like 650 events and 150 ridings in 11 provinces and territories, but who's counting? And I think they gave me maybe 1-2 days off in a 3-month stretch, and I was doing 6-8 events a day, a lot of them in cultural communities, and I was a surrogate spokesman when the Prime Minister wasn't available. So, I mean, I was completely enervated and just hibernated for a little while. And then people started to call me up and say, maybe you should think about running to replace Stephen. And, you know, that's a decision I sort of dreaded. I knew I'd have to make at some point. And frankly, I was just tired, a little bit tired of Ottawa, tired of the grind of 19 years here. And I'd been operating at a pretty high tempo as a minister for several years. So I started thinking seriously about other options. I was getting some interesting nibbles in the private sector, a think tank here, a nonprofit there. And it took several months for me to begin to think seriously about the situation in Alberta that ultimately drew my attention.
Okay. And what's it like? We will talk a lot about what's going on in Alberta, obviously. What's it like coming back to Ottawa after now a couple of years of being away?
Hasn't changed very much.
No.
But the National Arts Centre, nice to be here. This is what Andrew Cohen once described as resembling a Stalinist detention center. It looks a lot nicer now.
Yeah,
I like what you've done with the place.
One of my favorite responses to that is that my colleague David Reevely at the Ottawa Citizen dug out some photos of actual Stalinist detention centers.
And it was accurate.
Well, no, the thing about Stalinist detention centers is they're some of the most beautiful buildings in the capitals of the old Iron Curtain because...
Yeah, you go to the Terror Museum in Budapest, that's one example. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because everything's a lie. So, of course, the Stalinist detention centers look great. So this would have been the Ministry of Beauty or something, right? But it is looking pretty good, I got to say.
Well done.
Thanks partly thanks partly to your old colleague John Baird, who has.
He did the convention center behind us right here.
Yeah, he didn't physically actually do any of the building, but and it sounds better. I remember you and I were part of a crowd of people at a concert by the orchestra and Yo-Yo Ma, and you couldn't believe how bad it sounded.
Right.
The hall, but it's been renovated. You should come. You should, you know, in your ample spare time, you should come and
Actually, the reason I agreed to do this interview, I honestly thought this was Paul Wells in the knack, like with a symphonic background, and we were talking music. You were going to talk jazz and stuff like this.
Yeah.
I didn't know it was politics. I wouldn't have agreed to this if I'd known that.
No, it's going to be worse than your worst nightmare. And one more trip down memory lane, but there's a point to it. Several years ago, I visited for an interview in your old MP's office, which was in the East Block.
Yeah, beautiful building that right above, I think it's where John MacDonald kept the clerks of the Privy Council up there. Yeah.
Yeah. And who did you have to arm wrestle for that office? Like,
it was a hidden gem. Nobody knew about it. I had these like beautiful cathedral beams and exposed brick walls, and it was just one of the nicest offices, and nobody knew about it, so I just stumbled on it. Actually, there used to be Irish drinking parties there hosted by Pat O'Brien and some of the Irish MPs. That was their, like, they had a makeshift pub on the hill in the Chrétien government. That's where I found out about it. Kegs of Guinness lying around there.
And that stopped as soon as you moved in. The thing that I noticed there, as a columnist looking desperately for some fodder for an anecdote, is that you had 3 portraits of prominent political figures in the office. Sir Thomas More.
Which a lot of people, I would ask, they would thought it was Niccolo Machiavelli.
Yeah. Machiavelli, you didn't need a photo to remind you. It was all memorized. Thomas More, William Wilberforce, who was a reform figure in British politics.
The great the great abolitionist of the slave trade.
And Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And the thing that struck me at the time was only one of those 3 had actually gone on to lead a government. The others had been power behind the throne, agitator in the face of power. They hadn't been actual heads of government. And the conclusion I drew is that this guy's never actually going to run for a leadership position. He just wants to be the person to whom the leader owes everything. Was that just a flat wrong guess, or did you change your mind at some point?
Well, I actually not completely off. Like people ascribe to me ambition for leadership, which I never possessed myself, honestly. Like because of my hyperactivity politically during the Harper years, out on the road, in the party, reaching out, building. I think it's fair to say that I did a lot to build the party in those years. In the cynical mind of Ottawa, the assumption was I was only doing that to develop a leadership campaign, which wasn't true. I mean, I actually was passionate. Stephen Harper and I had this argument at the Mayfair, or the Royal Oak pub on Bank Street in 1995, after we watched Pulp Fiction together, believe it or not. By the way, I thought it was hilarious, and he was completely grossed out by it. So we debated Quentin Tarantino, and then I proposed that the future of the Conservative Party, if it ever wanted to be a governing coalition, had to lie with immigrant communities whose natural values and aspirations aligned with the Conservative Party. And just many didn't know that because we'd never bothered to introduce ourselves. And he disagreed with me passionately that night. He said most of these communities are hardwired into the Liberal electoral coalition. It's just, we can't undo 30 years of their political work. But in the early 2000s, after he became leader, he called me into his office and said, remember that debate we had 8 years ago at the, I was having a Guinness, he was having a Diet Coke at the Royal Oak. He said, I want you to prove me wrong. So I went out of that. I was actually passionate about proving the truth of my theory about the intuitive conservatism of most new Canadians. And for me, it was about the movement. It was about the principles that motivated my public service. It wasn't about an office, an empty aspiration. Okay. So I kind of surprised myself by what I decided to do in 2016 in Alberta.
And you did, to follow that thread, you did spend several years reaching out to immigrant communities and various religious communities. You got the nickname Minister of Curry in a Hurry. One of the questions I've had in recent months is who's doing that work in today's federal Conservative Party?
Yes, I have the question too. I mean, I think Andrew is doing a good job, and as I follow him, he's making a deliberate effort, and a lot of the folks that I attracted to the party as volunteer organizers are helping him out, helped out his leadership campaign. And so more needs to be done. but it's work that's too vast for any one person.
Okay. It is work that you've continued in Alberta.
To some extent, to the greatest extent I can. But a lot of my time has been in a pickup on the road, doing over 1,000 events in every corner of Alberta. Now I'm at a stage where I'm spending more time with cultural communities in the two big cities.
Okay. Is it strange to actually spend so much time in Alberta? Because one of the things you had the luxury of when you were a federal MP and a federal minister was you had a pretty safe riding, and you didn't actually have to keep an eye on it. Did Alberta change much while you were not away, but less frequently there?
Well, obviously, it changed in some respects, but there's a theory. Don Braid, a Calgary columnist, wrote a book about the NDP's election in 2015, the thesis of which is that Alberta's political culture fundamentally changed, and the NDP's election was evidence of that. And basically, his thesis is that through migration and millennials and so forth, that Alberta's political culture has moved to the left, maybe even to the center or center-left. And I think he is completely wrong. I think there is zero empirical evidence to support that. I really do believe that while the NDP's mandate is obviously legitimate, it was, in a political sense, an accidental outcome. They didn't expect to win that election, even, I think, on election day. Nobody else did. You had this perfect storm for them, a division between within the center-right coalition, the PCs and the Wild Rose Party, right down the middle. You had a lot of default free enterprise voters who stayed home as a reflection of their frustration with the choices, and some free enterprise voters who cast what they thought were risk-free protest votes for the NDP. Now we've reunited that free enterprise coalition. Our party has something like in our poll, a 36-point lead, other polls a 25-point lead. We have a healthy lead in every demographic, in every cohort, in every region of the province. And when I look at the issues, the predominance of concern about debt and deficit, about Alberta's role in the federation, about openness to healthcare reform and education, school choice, and so forth. But I look at the actual matrix of issues, Alberta looks like Alberta to me. People want a sensible, mainstream, center-right, free enterprise government and those kinds of practical solutions. So, no, I don't think it changed by orders of magnitude, perhaps changed by degree.
Let's turn to current events. And let me start with something that you tweeted when Kinder Morgan announced that it was going to give itself May to decide what was going to happen. You tweeted you didn't need the full 240 characters. You said that Canada's broken. How did Canada get broken? Who broke it? What do you mean by that?
Canada's the greatest country in the world. I'm a passionate Canadian national, something I inherited from my grandfather, who was a great Canadian, a lifetime member of the Liberal Party. And so I'm filled with nothing but optimism about Canada's future. What I meant was that our federation is not working. If, the promise of Confederation 151 years ago was of an economic union in the northern half of North America. And that's the premise of Confederation, which is now under assault. We have a provincial government in British Columbia which is arrogating to itself the power to determine what products can be exported from Canada's West Coast. That is explicitly violating the constitutional jurisdiction of the federal government on interprovincial infrastructure, and that in the process is attacking our country's vital economic interests. Can you think of any other state in the world? I can't, where one part of the country would say, we are going to sterilize this coast from exports of products that we don't particularly like. My point is simply this: the federation is not working, but if that is the case. But more deeply, there's in Alberta, a deep and growing sense of frustration. I've never seen it like this before. Because Albertans have a sense that we've done well, we've prospered, the energy sector has been a huge part of that, and we have shared much of that wealth. On average, about $20 billion net to the rest of the Federation through the whole system of fiscal federalism, equalization, and other transfers. So we're talking $200 billion in the last decade alone, hundreds of billions of dollars in recent decades that have been transferred from Alberta to help our fellow Canadians. Albertans are generous. They don't object to sharing some of our prosperity when times are good in our province and bad elsewhere. But Albertans have the sense that the opposite has been true recently. Other provinces that have been in a period of growth with lower unemployment and with surpluses have been receiving effectively transfers from unemployed Albertans through their federal taxes. And even that they could tolerate, but now they see political and opinion leaders in other parts of the country who are openly hostile to the development of the industry that helps to pay the freight. And so I think there's this growing sense amongst Albertans that, hold on a second here. You know, we've helped we've created enormous, Rex Murphy's very eloquent about how Alberta has been a great engine of social mobility for moving people from poverty and dependency to prosperity and opportunity, that people have moved to Alberta. We've been the most dynamic job market. And we've contributed disproportionately to the prosperity of the Federation. And now we feel like all of that we've built is under attack. People feel like they're being besieged. And I'm saying that's what's broken about the Federation now.
Okay. Let's unpack some of that. Alberta has been generous, has been a net contributor to equalization for your lifetime and mine. It hasn't had to take an oath of poverty to do that. Alberta per capita government spending before Rachel Notley became premier was the highest in the country.
And still
is higher now. The generosity of social programs, of health and education programs in Alberta is something that other provinces would sure like to match if they could. So it's not as though Alberta has spent itself into poverty over this time. And on the equalization program, you can see this one coming a mile away. You were a minister in the government that set in place the current equalization program. Was there not some discussion about changing it then?
Well, not only was there discussion, there were changes. You could do an interview with Danny Williams about those changes. Perhaps the changes didn't go far enough. But what was different then versus now is that we were at a time of prosperity, not a recession in Alberta, and we didn't have this alignment of forces trying to bottleneck our primary export and the driver of our prosperity. That's what's different now. I mean, I'll just give you one example. The largest recipient of equalization is the province of Quebec, and we had prominent Quebec political figures argue, and much of the political class, militating against Energy East, which would have allowed Quebec to displace foreign oil imports and to consume instead Alberta, Western Canadian energy, which helps to generate the wealth that is transferred through equalization. That was killed effectively, I believe, by the federal government telling the National Energy Board to get into the business of regulating up and downstream carbon emissions. And with it, the dream of energy independence died. Just at the same time, you've got Quebec opening a cement factory that emits 2 million metric tons of CO2 emissions, built with about $500 million of public loans and loan guarantees. The fiscal capacity for which, I would argue, in part comes through those equalization transfers. Which factory was exempted from environmental assessment or any limits on its carbon emissions, and which was developed by the guy who's the major shareholder of Bombardier, whose airplanes we subsidize, and which airplanes produce enormous CO2 and GHG emissions for which they are not limited or regulated. So Albertans say, hold on a second. We can't displace Venezuelan dictator oil with our energy, but we're supposed to subsidize CO2 producing industries that are not regulated while you're killing our pipeline with these regulations. So, we continue to be a relatively prosperous province. Albertans are generous, but this violates their sense of fairness.
Okay. Well, then you must be thrilled because things are looking up, because here's a federal government and a federal finance minister, Bill Morneau, who's working just about full time to figure out a way to pony up a federal stake in the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Isn't that great?
Well, is it a stake, or is it what the announcement we got last week was some form of limited and qualified indemnification? Look, I am not completely opposed to some form of public participation in the pipeline as a last resort, But the first resort it must be getting the thing built. And there's been no change in that. Kinder Morgan didn't come to the table 6 weeks ago saying they want a bailout, they want a backstop, they want a loan guarantee. They said what they want is legal certainty that they can build the thing in British Columbia. And so I don't think this is the federal government responding to the actual issue. They could and should use their constitutional authority to override any dilatory tactics from the BC New Democrats. I think they could, just for greater certainty, could invoke the declaratory power of the Constitution. In doing that, 9210C, there's a Senate bill that's now in front of the House of Commons. They could use the power of the federal purse. I believe this is what Pierre Trudeau would have done to protect federal jurisdiction. But the federal Liberals just gave BC $4.2 billion in discretionary infrastructure funding. They're negotiating the labor market agreement renewals. That's $1.1 billion of federal discretionary transfers. This is not health care. I think if they were remotely serious about this, they would have used the power of the purse to apply pressure to BC. So they can put in the loan guarantees or indemnification, but if that doesn't stop the legal runaround, the death by delay strategy, the war in the woods strategy, then what has anybody gained?
So what does the power of the purse look like? What's going on in British Columbia now that the federal government should stop paying for?
Well, I've identified two things in particular, which is the over $4 billion in discretionary federal infrastructure transfers. I would say to the government of British Columbia, if you're going to block a $7.4 billion private sector infrastructure investment that will create thousands of jobs and generate hundreds of billions of dollars of value for the country, then we're not going to give you $4 billion of discretionary infrastructure money. So we'll give you that check as soon as construction is well underway for Kinder Morgan. Or the job training funds. You're going to kill thousands of jobs? You want us to reward you with $1 billion in labor market agreement funding? No, we're going to apply a condition that you respect the Constitution, the rule of law, and free trade within Canada before doing so. By the way, I've always been a hawk on internal free trade. I was a guy around the Harper cabinet table arguing for use of using the federal constitutional authority to override interprovincial trade barriers in goods and services and labor. So this is not a new position for me.
The declaratory power that you talk about was last used in 1961, because it's fallen out of fashion for a long time. Is our circumstances so dire that we go back to what was common practice when Diefenbaker was the Prime Minister?
Or I think more like when Laurier was Prime Minister, was more often used before the Second World War. The answer is yes, this is developing into a constitutional crisis. and it's almost existential for the future of our economy, in my judgment. By far the largest Canadian export product has been our energy. Our balance of trade would be a deficit, would be significantly worse were it not for the energy that we currently export. We have the third largest oil reserves on Earth, which have a current notional global value of over $11 trillion. Our ability to pay for manage our debts, growing healthcare costs, infrastructure, and all of that is partly dependent on our ability to get some value, real value. But we're selling our oil to the Americans at a massive discount. It's costing us now about $50 million a day as an economy. It costs the Alberta Treasury billions a year. So I can't think of a higher stakes game that we've faced in terms of interprovincial trade in our modern history, for sure.
Normally, the way that these knots get untied in Canada is through court cases, and there are two references in two provinces which are heading towards court hearings. British Columbia is testing its ability to do the sort of stuff that you find upsetting, and a different file, but one that's worth talking about. Saskatchewan is testing the federal government's ability to impose a carbon tax. That's the way it rolls. I have a hunch that you think that BC is not going to win its reference. So, won't things get better over time?
Well, perhaps they will, but time is not on the side of this project. Time is on the side of the enemies of, I submit, economic progress. The very clear integrated strategy of the opponents of the energy industry is death by delay. And Paul, I've got to pull the camera back here for a second, okay? This didn't just sort of unfold in the lab. People might think, oh, the BC NDP came to office and suddenly decided to pick a fight on this pipeline. No, 10 years ago, in 2008, the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation hosted a meeting in New York with a couple of dozen environmental organizations in which they developed something called the Tar Sands Initiative, an integrated, multifaceted political strategy to landlock Canada's oil sands from getting to global markets. Why? Because I assume that those activists concluded they couldn't stop a barrel of oil from being produced or shipped from Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, or Qatar. But they could. They saw us as the global Boy Scouts, as the soft political target. Vivian Krause in Vancouver has detailed how that foreign foundations, primarily the U.S. as far as we know, have invested tens and tens of millions of dollars in this campaign to give this huge industry make it out to be the moral equivalent of big tobacco. So what we're dealing with now is just the culmination of that campaign. I mean, the BC Environment Minister 2 months ago attended a weekend conflab with these organizations, many of which are involved in active civil disobedience. So when I say there's a strategy here, and the strategy is death by delay, I mean it. It's a coordinated strategy, and the legal strategy of the BC government is just part of that. And there are many other legal challenges coming forward from First Nations being funded by foreign foundations. There's the civil disobedience. There's municipal governments refusing to grant permits. It's this entire constellation of delays which has caused the project proponent, after spending $1 billion, to say they may be willing to give that up.
Okay. In 2012...
You remind me, so I'm sorry to interrupt. Power of the purse. The federal government here is withholding $60 million, I think, from the government of Saskatchewan for not complying with its cap or trade or carbon tax strategy. So they're willing to use the power of the purse against provinces that are non-compliant with one side of their energy climate strategy, but not the other side.
Okay. You pulled the camera back to 2008, and that was pertinent and useful and worthwhile information. Let me push it forward to 2012, when the federal government of the day decided it was going to do everything it could to accelerate the development of new oil pipelines, and hit a succession of brick walls. Christy Clark was the Liberal Premier of British Columbia at the time. She came up with 5 conditions for Northern Gateway. And the government of the day, what you remember, was very leery about directly confronting Premier Clark. That project was delayed until a successor government, Trudeau's, could kill it. It seems to me that your own history in federal government is not one of particularly greater success at combating these forces of delay.
Well, first of all, during the tenure of the Harper government, there were 4 large pipeline projects that were approved and built, which increased oil shipments by about 1.8 million barrels per day, doubling the shipment capacity for our industry. And secondly, in terms of coastal pipelines, we approved the Northern Gateway pipeline 5 months after it had been approved by the National Energy Board. It's true the court said Crown needs to go back and do more Aboriginal consultation. By the way, I spent 10 days, as Stephen Harper said to any minister with anything remotely attached to that file, get into northern British Columbia, talk to the First Nations. In my case, I went there bearing gifts with $20 million of additional job training funds to help Aboriginal communities participate in the economic opportunity. So we had advice from Justice that we had discharged the Crown's obligation to consult. The court disagreed. I think you'll admit that is a bit of a moving target as to what discharges the duty to consult. But that was approved, and then it was arbitrarily vetoed by Prime Minister Trudeau, who then effectively killed Energy East. August 23rd, 2017, Russ Girling, the CEO of TransCanada, says we're putting the pause button on this $8 billion project to displace foreign oil imports from Eastern Canada, Energy East, because of regulatory uncertainty created by the National Energy Board. This is September 7th, which required that they take account for up and downstream carbon emissions. By the way, Barack Obama didn't veto Keystone XL going to the U.S. Gulf Coast until a week after Stephen Harper had left office. I don't think that's a coincidence. This federal government surrendered without any diplomatic repercussions for that. And now I submit they've done nothing substantive to fight for Trans Mountain. So I think their record is one of surrender, whereas ours was, and by the way, we were criticized. The NDP and the Liberals voted against a bill that we brought in to limit the time during which the NEB could consider an application for a pipeline. They criticized us for advertising to Canadians about the importance of environmentally responsible resource development. They besmirched the reputation of the NEB, which was considered one of the most credible regulators in the world in this space. So I think our record is defensible.
Okay. I'm struck by your assertion that the Prime Minister doesn't want this pipeline actually to be built. He seems to be spending an awful lot more time working to get it built in the face of opposition from the British Columbia government, even though they've got 19 seats in British Columbia, than he is trying to hold back the government of Alberta, even though they've only got 4 seats in Alberta, maybe none in the next election. I mean, all of the political advantage, and Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, has seen this, all of the political advantage, if you're on the left of center, is in opposing this pipeline. And yet it seems to me this Prime Minister is putting a lot of political capital into championing this pipeline. Am I missing something?
Well, I'll tell you what we're missing is action. We're getting bromides, but no action. You know, willing to punish the government of Saskatchewan for not imposing a punitive carbon tax on its citizens by withholding federal transfers, but rewarding the government of British Columbia that's in flagrant violation of the Constitution, that's creating this economic and constitutional crisis. I don't think that reflects the seriousness that this requires. Look, all I know is this is a Prime Minister who said, and I don't really believe it was a slip of the tongue, that he looks forward to the day we phase out the oil sands in Canada, whose principal secretary, who we know has very considerable influence, Jerry Butts, when he was head of the World Wildlife Federation, was asked, do you have an alternative pipeline route? Because he was speaking against every one of these proposals. He said, no to any alternative pipeline routes. I want an alternative economy without hydrocarbons. I think that's the motive force of this government. You know, I think they're trying to manage conflicting political pressures within the Federation, pro-development voters, Green voters, Alberta and Saskatchewan. But I can only measure them by their actions, which so far have been underwhelming.
Okay. What do you make of Rachel Notley's actions?
I think of late, they're impressive. I think she's a little bit late to the game. The BC New Democrats signed their agreement with the Green Party a year ago this week. They then came to office in July of last year on an explicit promise to do everything possible and use every available tool to immediately shut down the Trans Mountain pipeline. I think she should have responded with, by making it clear there would be very grave consequences then. I proposed a fight back strategy last summer, starting with diplomacy and persuasion. If that didn't work, economic sanctions up to and including, I talked about the wine boycott last summer, safety inspections on BC exports going through Alberta. I talked about potentially tolling BC natural gas that passes through Alberta to the United States markets. And I talked about replicating Peter Lougheed's 1980 strategy on the NEP, which was the turn off the taps legislation to raise retail, the prices at the pump. When I proposed these things 10 months ago, Premier Notley, for whom I have considerable regard, mocked and ridiculed these ideas. She said I was having a temper tantrum, acting like Donald Trump, that I wanted to build a wall around Alberta and make BC pay for it, which I thought was a clever line. And then in January, February of this year, that became her policy. So imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I'm glad she's adopted some of these ideas. My concern is that her fellow New Democrat, John Horgan, doesn't think she's serious about it.
Okay. We've been talking a lot about half of the energy environment equation. On the environment side, on the climate change side, you've been making some interesting statements lately. You're often accused of not having any policy at all to control climate change. And lately you've contradicted that. What is your plan on climate change?
Well, we'll publish a realistic plan on the environment and on climate change in our platform about 11 months from now, next spring. But right now what we're looking at is reverting to, I think, what was the first levy or tax on carbon emissions In Canada, it was introduced by the previous PC government, but it was focused on major industrial emitters. It didn't punish consumers for heating their homes in the winter or driving their cars to work. It was a levy on major emitters that 100% of which revenues went into a tech fund. And I think that's where the solution will be found. It's not punishing seniors for heating their homes when it's 20 below outside. It's in thousands of small technological advances that will shrink the carbon intensity of industry that we will actually, and we've done that in Alberta, by the way. The oil sands, the carbon footprint of a barrel of bitumen is a third of what it was 20 years ago. This happened through intensive research, a lot of it done at our great universities in Alberta. So fund more of that. So that's also, much of that becomes exportable to developing countries that have environmental challenges. Secondly, I'm interested in the regulatory approach being taken by the Saskatchewan government. One thing they're doing is to help accelerate agricultural practices of zero-tillage farming that create carbon, that allow for vast areas of farmland to become a carbon sequestration. And thirdly, I'd be willing to look at some positive incentives for consumers in terms of energy efficiency. But we'll spell all that out next year.
Does that suite of measures bring you within a country mile of meeting Alberta's share of the 2030 climate targets?
I don't know. We're going to have to do the math on all of this. All I know is that apparently according to the UN, Canada is at least 90 megatons short of the Paris target. I think we should keep that as an aspirational target, but we should not impose on our country massive economic costs that no other country is imposing on themselves. And this is the problem of carbon leakage. Since the Alberta NDP imposed a carbon tax in our province, not only because of that, but other policies, we've seen the flight of nearly $40 billion of capital from oil and gas in Alberta to oil and gas in North Dakota, Colorado, Texas, Kazakhstan, Iran. The capital has stayed in the industry, so it's not a function of price. I think it's a function of policy. All of that money has gone to develop oil and gas in jurisdictions that do not have carbon taxes. And they do not have, do you think Iran or Saudi or Russia have serious plans to meet the Paris target? So my point is, carbon leakage, maybe we'll feel more virtuous about ourselves if we kill jobs in Canada, but if all we're doing is creating jobs in countries that take the environment less seriously, the world is no better off.
So your goal is to impose costs on large final emitters in Alberta that are not serious enough to provoke a carbon flight, a carbon leakage.
We didn't see that flight of investment when there was what's known as the specified gas emitter regulation under the previous government prior to 2015. In fact, the industry was copacetic with that.
Okay. Copacetic because it wasn't a very high price.
Yeah, and you could say the same thing about the retail carbon taxes, the advocates for which say that for them to bend the curve sufficiently on consumption to hit Paris targets requires a price of $300 a ton, which is, in Alberta right now we're at $30 a ton. So I say it's time for for Minister McKenna and company to be honest with Canadians. This is a frog in the pot strategy. You put the frog in a pot of boiling water, he jumps out, cold water, and gradually turn it up from a lukewarm to a simmer to a boil. You've got a boiled frog. They want the price to go to $200 and then $300 a ton, and consumers to get gradually used to paying outrageously more to heat their homes and drive to work. I don't think that's a responsible environmental strategy.
Okay. Do you think this is essentially a contrived problem, the climate change?
No.
Okay, then at some point, do you need responses on the scale of the problem?
It's the problem is the tragedy of the commons. We could shut down the Canadian economy tomorrow, and it would make negligible, if any, measurable difference in global greenhouse gas emissions. China, in a year or two, its growth in emissions would make up for the elimination of the entire Canadian economy. So my point is, let's be balanced about this, and let us recognize that we are a big, cold, spread out, northern, highly developed, industrialized economy that is a major energy producer. There are some unique characteristics. So of course we have higher than average per capita emissions. That is a function of who we are.
Okay. Whenever I hear someone saying that Canada could shut down its economy and it wouldn't make any difference in the global greenhouse gas score, I love that argument because it's a very good argument for me not paying any income taxes. Because I can't afford, my income taxes aren't going to pay for the equalization system, or they're not going to pay for $300 billion of infrastructure. So I might as well not pay any. Or do I have to pay my share?
Yeah, of course we have to do our part. But we have to do our part without inflicting upon ourselves costs that are not shared elsewhere.
Okay. I've used a good chunk of my time talking about basically two issues, oil and climate change. If you're lucky enough to become Premier of Alberta, how much of your attention is going to go to those two files? How much to the entire rest? I have no idea what the answer is. How much of your time are you going to be?
Well, I suspect Premier Notley would say she's spending a lot more time. I doubt when she dreamed of becoming a Democrat Premier of Alberta, she'd imagine she'd be spending all of her time fighting for a Texas-based pipeline company. So and you know, Stephen Harper will tell you he'd never imagined he would have spent much, if not most of his time as Prime Minister on foreign policy. So events happen, and I think thanks to my governing experience here, I've got the disposition to respond to emerging events. But listen, I think this is a hugely important. In the 1980s, the 70s and 80s, Peter Lougheed, in many ways, was the counterpoint to Ottawa in developing a coalition of provinces against federal overreach. And I think that's a natural role for Alberta to play. So I'm already thinking forward and working with other provincial leaders across the country about how Alberta can play that role again. It's our perspective from the West, for many of us, that Premiers Brad Wall and Scott Moe have been doing double duty as the kind of de facto leaders of the resource industries of Western Canada. Alberta, I think, needs to step up to the plate. And I think that will be the central question in the next Alberta election a year from now. Who can most effectively fight for our prosperity, for our province, for our core industries?
Okay. You had a party convention last weekend?
2.5 weeks.
Okay, time flies. And it was designed to introduce the United Conservative Party to Alberta and to the world. And it was the largest political convention in Alberta history. There were a couple glitches. There were some resolutions that were passed by the members that friends and allies of yours had argued against, requiring minors to get parental consent for invasive medical procedures, which could include abortion, it could include vaccination, and also to get parental consent for joining after-school clubs, which include LGBTQ, Gay Straight Alliance clubs and things like that. After those resolutions passed, two things happened. First of all, you said you're not going to feel bound by those resolutions. And secondly, a website in which you advertise your willingness to be led by the members rather than to contradict them at every turn crashed. Is that website functional as of today?
I don't think so. It was my leadership campaign website. Nice spin, Paul. But the reality is that was my leadership campaign website. And
all I know is what I read from Jason Markisoff. So.
Yeah, so it's true that my digital guys took down my leadership campaign website a few weeks ago because we were spending a couple $1,000s a month to host a site that no one was going to for a campaign that ended 7 months ago. But my so-called grassroots guarantee for policy development was for a very robust process that we led up to our founding convention. I think it was actually the most that we actually let every one of our 110,000 members vote on every one of the resolutions, which was unprecedented. But the fifth point in my plan was the leader would appoint a platform committee to develop a comprehensive, positive vision for the future of our province. So that's always been, and of course the leader's going to do that. Of course, you know, a few dozen policy resolutions cannot constitute a costed and comprehensive platform. So there's no news there. You know, when you open up a process like we did, there's always going to be a risk that there's some things that are passed that are contentious. One of those resolutions was very poorly worded, and I've told people how I'm interpreting it as a requirement, as an affirmation of the long-standing requirement in Alberta law that parents be notified about content in the schools dealing with religion or human sexuality. And even the NDP seems to agree that that is sensible. They've not sought to change that. But this was, look, I think you're missing the forest here for the trees. This was the culmination of 18 months of amazing political work We took two warring factions, brought them together. We had a 95% ratification vote for this unity. It's now the largest provincial party in Canada in terms of membership, the most popular political party in Canada in terms of polling. This is something a lot of people thought could not be done when we started it 2 years ago. So I'd like to look at the convention as a success.
I ask about it because it's a sensitive point in kind of the your own history in politics. Some of the earliest conversations we had when you were a member of the Reform Party were about how the old Progressive Conservative, the old federal Progressive Conservative Party would have policy conferences and people would troop off to the policy conferences, and then Kim Campbell and Brian Mulroney would say thanks but no thanks, we're going to do what we want to do. Does that history occur to you when you're deciding which policy resolutions from the convention to apply?
I'm mindful of it, for sure. And I do think that what you describe is one of the reasons for the division in the free enterprise politics in Canada in the 1990s and 80s. There was a sense that a lot of people in the coalition were just thrown in the ditch and disregarded. And that's not what I'm doing. In fact, as I develop the platform, I think this will be a first in Canadian politics, but I'm actually going to do regular surveys of the members that really will help to inform, because I don't want to get offside our core supporters. But a premier has to govern, a government has to govern for the entire population. In our case, 4.3 million Albertans, not 110,000 party members. So I think people understand you've got to balance those things out. But I will never end up in a situation like my former colleague Patrick Brown ended up here in Ontario, where he committed the Ontario PC Party to a carbon tax without consulting the members and with massive hostility towards the idea from his electorate and his party base. So no, I'm not going to go to that extreme of almost purposefully disregarding the views of our membership. The resolutions they passed, the input they give us will constitute important input in the development of our platform. But there may be some points of derivation. Okay.
The old Wild Rose Party was often factious enough to give its various leaders a headache. You've taken that party and the old Progressive Conservative Party and you formed this new UCP. Is the U in that accurate? Is it wishful thinking? How heterogeneous is the membership of the UCP?
Quite. You would have seen this at our convention. I would say about a third of the people there, of our 2,600 delegates, were most recently active in the PC Party, about a third most recently active in Wild Rose, and about a third had never been to a party event before, which is the cool part. That's the exciting part. I go to events every day. I'm doing party events. How many people here, this is your first event? 25, 30% of the crowd put up their hands. That is my focus, which is not just the marriage of two former factions, because that's going very well, but it's Albertans took for granted, many of us, our prosperity and our stability. You know, we thought the politics would take care of itself. And my message is that you can't take that for granted anymore. We had the lowest typical turnout in provincial elections in Canada, often averaging barely above 40%. Over 95% of people were never involved in a campaign or a party. So we're trying to get a deeper sense of civic engagement through this, and those new people are helping to bring, I think, new energy, new idealism, and they're kind of the glue that are holding together the formerly divided factions. But I got to tell you, we don't see it. You saw it federally. There was a lot of skepticism. How would the merger work? The different cultures of the parties. It worked very well in that in the many years I was in the post-merger CPC caucus, I cannot remember a issue that divided our caucus or cabinet or party along legacy party lines. And I see evidence of the same kind of unity of purpose in our new party in Alberta. You know, it's true, we might have lost a couple of hundred activists from the periphery of the two legacy parties, but 95% voted yes for the merger. So it doesn't get much better than that.
Has one of the dangers in Alberta political culture over the last 40 years been the fact that the governing party was just almost guaranteed of getting back into power? Does that not tend to produce a certain complacency? And from that angle, isn't the Rachel Notley election a handy shot in the arm to Alberta's political culture?
Yes, Yes, I'm not happy that it happened. I'm not happy with the policy consequences of it.
I like that bit where you struggled before deciding that you might as well agree with me. That's a common reaction. Oh, what the hell?
Well, let me tell you, Stephen Harper and I, from my recollection, we were at a Canadian Special Forces base west between Erbil and Mosul when we were briefed that the NDP had won the election in Alberta, and we wondered if maybe we should stay back there. But you know, the NDP was elected for, like, I think the fundamental reason was Albertans said, we're tired of a party that seems to be taking us for granted, that seems entitled to power, that has developed a culture of arrogance. And Wild Rose didn't. So the way I characterize, I'm very blunt. I said this to our convention 2 weeks ago. Progressive Conservative Party, after 45 years in office, had begun to represent arrogance. The Wild Rose Party was seen as unready to govern because of a lack of discipline. And so we must compensate for those two weaknesses by demonstrating a culture of humility and a culture of discipline in this new party. And the NDP has done some things that I support and respect. They've cleaned up the former culture of patronage, of overpaying people in agencies, boards, and commissions, getting corporate and union money out of politics, and promoting greater transparency. These are a number of things that Albertans wanted to happen regardless of who was in office.
And over the last year, partly because it was coming back from so far behind, Alberta has led the country in economic growth. Over the past year, Alberta has had the sharpest decline in residents who are relying on employment insurance of any province. After 11 more months of that, this incumbent government that you're facing might have a pretty good story to tell. Would you prefer that the election were held a little sooner?
The election under legislation is supposed to happen about a year from now. We'll wait and see what happens with Kinder Morgan. I think that there may be an argument, if this project fails, that we need to hit the reset button in Alberta politics. But in terms of the economy, the NDP was sworn in 3 years ago today, I believe. Our gross domestic product today is smaller than it was in 2014. Our labor force participation is down significantly. We continue to have the highest unemployment in Canada outside the Atlantic region. Calgary continues to have the highest unemployment of any major city in the country. Tens of billions of dollars of capital have fled the province. More people, food banks say that they're still seeing twice as many people coming to their doors as was the case 3 years ago. So the notion that somehow happy times are here again is not being felt by most Albertans.
Okay. What is your project for Alberta in Canada? Surely it can't be sort of putting out fires on pipeline projects indefinitely. What do you want to see Alberta doing as a society and as a part of the Confederation 5 years out?
Well, I think we have a unique and special role to play in the Federation that Alberta has through much of its modern history as a key engine of prosperity, which has helped to other parts of the country. We'd like that prosperous Alberta to be back in a way that we can afford to share some of our wealth with other parts of the country, that we can be that engine of social mobility. And that would be my focus. What I'm really thinking about in developing our platform, I'm taking some cues from Arthur Brooks, the president of the American Enterprise Institute, in his book, Conservatism of the Heart. I really want us to focus on ideas developed by some Canadians like Yuval Levine about using market tools for social mobility. Even in the good times, there were too many Albertans left behind, too many people in our First Nations communities, too many immigrants unable to use their education and professional training, left at the margins of the labor market. And so even in the best of times, we've had many serious social problems. So I want us to, my vision is of a province that has the right policy setting to become an engine of wealth creation so that we can then redistribute some of that wealth for true equality of opportunity. And by the way, I think we're going to have a mandate to be ambitious with a policy reform agenda. Recent BC governments kicked the can down the road on a number of issues. I'll give you one example, healthcare reform. Alberta has the most expensive health system in the country per capita, but we don't have the results that justify it. I say Albertans should have at least as many choices as British Columbians and Quebecers have in terms of a mix of private delivery within universal insurance. So I'm prepared to take school choice, empowering parents to choose the best education for their kids. It's a great Alberta tradition that I think we can amplify. So I think we can be, the idea of a federation is you get a series of policy laboratories and provinces can innovate. I want us to be an innovative government. Alberta was this in the 1990s. We can be that again.
We asked for questions from readers on Twitter. What do they want to ask Jason Kenney? Most of their responses stuff I've just incorporated into our conversation tonight. But the question that got most retweeted,
all the really rude stuff.
Man, well, okay. So my favorite, my favorite is Mr. Kenney so desperate for power that he will say or do anything for votes? Yes, no.
No.
Okay. I think we've seen the opposite tonight, sir. No, but the question that was most often retweeted was, which LGBTQ organizations have you met with since becoming UCP leader? And I think that expresses a concern in some corners that not everyone will be welcome in this new Alberta, including LGBTQ groups.
That's not true. In fact, on the Sunday of our convention, I had a meeting about this resolution that passed with the LGB Tory group and a group called Parents for Choice in Education, where I already got them working together on a joint resolution where they agree on the right balance between protecting kids in schools who are going through difficult challenges and parents' involvement in the education system. We applied to go to the Edmonton and a gay pride parade. I was happy to participate in that. We were told that we're not welcome to go. So we'll continue to we're going to have a reception at the margins of that event. Listen, Paul, when I became Minister of Immigration, the very first interest group that I met with, that at my invitation, was EGAL, because they'd written to me wanting to raise issues around the consideration of gay refugee claims. And I immediately instructed the IRB to work with EGAL to train decision makers to understand the subtleties and nuances of claims on the grounds of sexual orientation. And then I read in the Toronto Star, my favorite journal, a story about a guy who was trying to bring in gay refugees who had fled Iran, were living in Turkey, and he was running into bureaucracy at Immigration Canada. I personally picked up the phone, called this guy, met with him in Toronto the first month I was minister. I flew over to Ankara. I went to places in eastern Turkey to meet with gay Iranian refugees who were living underground, and created an underground railroad with this organization, the Iranian Queer Railway Network, that brought hundreds of people from potential execution in Iran to security in Canada. And I've talked recently, because I think I need to be a little bit more personal about this stuff. I talked recently about how, when I was in college in San Francisco in the late 1980s, I volunteered occasionally at North America's first AIDS hospice, established by Mother Teresa and her missionaries of charity, doing menial work there. But so I think I know where my heart is, and I will continue. Is it true? I voted for the traditional definition of marriage, and so if people want to condemn me as a moral reprobate for that, then they better be prepared to do the same thing to everybody who was in democratic politics until, the last 5 or 10 years, including Pierre Trudeau and Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin and Tommy Douglas and Hillary and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. So if that's the contemporary barometer for tolerance and respect for human dignity, then I would say apply it consistently.
Okay. My friend Trevor over here is saying that we're out of time. I know that we could continue this conversation all night, but we are going to have many months to discuss all these issues, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
And you're welcome to come out and do some field work in Alberta sometime. Come out for the Stampede. Do you have any cowboy
Lisa, when were we in Alberta last? We were there several weeks ago, and I'll be back, don't you worry. But enough about me. Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. And there'll be a reception somewhere in this cavernous building that you can all join us at. And Jason is going to be kind enough to come and join and schmooze. So thanks. Good night, everyone.